All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Bruce Heterick. As Susan said, I work with JSTOR in Portico, and I have spent a ridiculous amount of my life over the last 3 years looking into this topic, and just wanted to share with you a few things that we found. These are particular to JSTOR, because that's the data I was looking at, but I thought it might be instructive for some of the publishers in the audience to be looking at this stuff in a particular way. This is very much a peeling layers of an onion. Doing analysis on this stuff is very hard, and primarily because it's very difficult to tell as a content provider when something when a search has originated at a discovery service, because it gets hidden by the link resolver that's actually coming to your site. So it's very difficult for me to know at JSTOR how many things have come to us, started at EDS or started at Primo or started at any of the other services. And so we had to do a large deep dive into our usage data to really try to dig in and see what effects discovery services were having, particularly at JSTOR. Now, like Amira said, we started hearing from libraries about 5 years ago, oh, please put all your content into discovery service A, B, or C. The discovery providers were coming to us asking us for the content. And obviously, we wanted to accommodate that as best we could. But I was very curious because I wanted to see what impacts actually felt from this. And I was seeing data from dozens, probably hundreds of institutions who had implemented these things, where their usage at JSTOR was doing some very dramatic things once these discovery services were implemented. So I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. So we did a pretty deep dive into this from basically for all of 2013. And we basically worked with the discovery services to understand when customers had implemented these services. And we looked at the JSTOR usage before and after to see what the impacts were. Because there's a generally held view in the ecosystem that these things are good for everybody. Good for the libraries, good for the publishers, good for the users. And I think in the vast majority of cases that is true. I think discovery services, as Amira was pointing out, have some very good place in many different use cases. But at JSTOR, what we found is that wasn't always the case. It wasn't necessarily the case. In fact, we saw from our earlier data that in some institutions, in many institutions, the drop in usage was actually greater once discovery services had been implemented. Now, why is that important? To us, it's important for two very big reasons. Number one is, as a not-for-profit, we have limited resources, and we're trying to figure out where to spend those resources. So we want to understand what impacts things are having, and if they're having a big impact, what resources we need to put to that to either make it better or to make our content better so that it works within these systems. The second reason is, and how many publishers in here have content that's on the JSTOR platform? Any? I have a couple. One of the other reasons is that the revenue share that we put with publishers has a large basis on usage. So if usage is dropping, that has a negative impact on some of the publishers and their revenue share, and that's important from their perspective. So we wanted to really understand this a little bit better. So from this deep dive, we came to find out a number of things, and these are specific to JSTOR. Number one is that subject metadata in your metadata matters a lot across all of these systems. This is the primary relevancy point for them. And what we came to understand from JSTOR's perspective was we built our metadata for preservation purposes. That was JSTOR's original mission, was the long-term preservation of this content. And access was a byproduct of that. And so we have discovered that we really need to go back in and upgrade our metadata on the subject basis, because we don't populate subjects as well as some of the other resources. And that has a big impact on the relevancy that you have in these systems. The other thing we came to find out was that many libraries don't spend enough time actually configuring these systems. So they come to them, they do some minimal configuration, and what we found out from one of the providers is that over 50% of their customers had not even configured JSTOR into their systems. I mean, and so JSTOR content was not even showing up. That is a huge problem. What that says to you is that the discovery service provider can do everything they are supposed to do, the content provider can do everything they're supposed to do, but the library doesn't spend the time and energy to actually configure these systems properly and to keep them configured properly. You have the problem of your content not actually showing up. Finally, for us, what we discovered was that we were not spending enough time syndicating our data. We didn't have the systems. We were sort of treating everyone exactly as the same thing, fitting that square peg into that round hole, and that we needed to do a lot of work in how we actually syndicate our data. We have archival content, we have current content, we have books. They all need to get to those providers in different ways and on different time frames. So that was really important. I did a plenary at Charleston on this back at the end of 2013. If anybody wants to go and see, I go into this in a lot more detail, but those are the basic outcomes of that. So when you actually look at where usage is coming to JSTOR, you can see that we still have a lot of people start at JSTOR. Google and Google Scholar drive a lot of usage to us. And then you can see there's some link resolvers in here. And this is kind of the top 10 list of what's driving usage at JSTOR. Now, why it's important, this comes from the investment standpoint. Right now, over the last 3 years, JSTOR has averaged spending between $300,000 and $400,000 a year on web scale discovery service, on data syndication, on usage analysis, on people maintaining the system so they can get content out to these discovery services. It's not an insignificant amount of money. Not every publisher in this room is going to be able to afford to do that in the way that actually needs to be done to work with these discovery services in a very up-to-date manner. And so when you look at this chart, which shows this is where usage, where we see usage beginning, and you have a limited investment set, web scale discovery service would not be at the top of your list of where you would make investments, because we see very little traffic coming from those web scale discovery services that we can see. Now, I've highlighted the fact that we have this 22% in the that are deemed academic. Those are things that have a .edu domain coming to us. There's a good chance that a good percentage of that is web scale discovery traffic from the institution. So one of the things that we're trying to work with NISO is actually to create a persistent identifier that starts at the discovery service and comes to us, so that we can actually see when something begins at EDS or begins at Primo or begins at any of the other services, so that we can actually begin to track this information much more reliably than we can today. So this brings me to kind of my final 2 points, and that is this. Libraries have a responsibility in this sort of collective space we're in. We talk a lot about discovery providers, we talk a lot about publishers and content providers, but libraries have a responsibility here too. And I think that's been somewhat not really talked about as much as it should be. Everybody has a responsibility here, and JSTOR, from our deep dive, we understood some of the things that we've needed to change in order to be more effective in these services. But Laura's going to talk about the ODI initiative from NISO. But if you look at this, what's interesting in these deliverables, there's recommended practices for content providers and for discovery service providers. There's not recommended practices for libraries. There need to be, because there are responsibilities that have to happen in order for these things to work right across the entire ecosystem. So one of the things that we did was understanding that libraries weren't exactly configuring these things consistently or reliably. We created quick reference guides for each of the services, so that if you're a librarian, you can come and pick up this quick reference guide. If you're using Primo as your service and Serial Solutions as your link resolver, you can come and understand how your settings need to be set in those systems if you want your JSTOR content to actually show up. And we did that for each of the systems, because while a library may decide they don't want their JSTOR content to show up, that's perfectly fine. That's something they choose to do at that institution. We didn't want libraries not doing it just because they didn't know they were supposed to do it. And so we wanted to put something out there that libraries could reference on how to make that content available. I know IEEE has done the same thing. A couple of other publishers have moved in this direction of actually creating reference guides for librarians to use for configuring those systems. So I encourage publishers to think about that, because if you want your content to actually have the best chance of showing up in these systems, you probably need to create some sort of guides to help the libraries. Not everyone has the resources that Harvard has or Northeastern. As Amir was saying, there are a lot of small schools who have implemented these services that just don't have the resources to do that on a daily basis. So they need help. And I would encourage publishers to think about how they can move in that front. And I'll turn it over to Laura.